the IAGP president to really take a moment to welcome everyone from around the world to this wonderful event where we have the opportunity, using technology, to have a conversation and learn from two distinguished colleagues in a place that people feel safe and can talk and can listen and understand from one another. And I really want to thank Janer Bengal for organizing this, and Mimo Agresta, Dr. Agresta, for all of his help in organizing webinars for IAGP like this. I also see my friend Vamik Volkin in the audience, and I want to say hello, Vamik, and you and Betty. And so I think that's all. I really hope everyone can learn and to listen and to appreciate the value of communicating with each other. Eva?
Thank you, Richard. Welcome, everybody. Unfortunately, it is the time of the war. We come to this point step by step, starting from the global collective trauma of COVID-19. And then nowadays, at the corner of Europe, there is an invasion and there is war, and there is also pain for everybody. And AGP is trying to create a structure as an umbrella to contain all colleagues. Nowadays, it is not easy, but we are very lucky that here, dear Robi Friedman from Israel, and he is clinical psychologist. You all know, but I have to tell a little bit more. Clinical psychologist and group analyst and president of the Group Analytics Society, president of the IDI. He is co-founder of the Israeli Institute of Group Analysis and is current president and past president of the Israel Association for Group Psychotherapy. And he has conducted lots of groups and private practice and teaches at the Haifa University as he writes on dream telling and relational disorders. Nowadays, he is conducting also groups in Agatin in many countries, and he has conducted conflict dialogues with Palestinians and participates and in West Islam dialogue with a group led by Dr. Vamik Volkin and Lord John Alderdis. From Iran, but nowadays he is in Vienna, Bijan, and then he is a veteran strategy advisor for the West Asian markets and has over 25 years of strategic consulting experience. So we are ready to listen to Eva. Thank you.
So I wish to welcome you, and I'm very glad to see my old co-board member of the IAGP board, Robi Friedman. We've worked together for a long time in IAGP. And my new friend, Dr. Bijan, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you. And we welcome all the attendees that are here today. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you very much. These were very good years in the board. And thank you, Kanel, and everyone else, Richard, who invited us. Bijan, you come from a bigger country. You want to start?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for this very warm welcome, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really look forward to, first of all, showing that Iranians and Israelis can actually work together and can engage in a dialogue, but also to discuss maybe some important aspects of this relationship and what it is that people like us can do to help de-escalate and help both nations understand the other one better. So I look forward to the discussion.
And we will try to have a dialogue between Bijan and me. I want to say right now that we are both part of a body, as actually maybe you can call it a think tank. Vamik initiated a body of people who are psychologically informed or want to look at politics from a different perspective. And Bijan and me, we talked about that we take only 2 minutes to explain what we mean by psychologically informed. I can give one example. The Americans were in Jerusalem trying to make a dialogue between Israel and Palestine. This was maybe 6, 7 years ago. And 3 of the IDI, me and Reuven Merchav and Khiba Husseini, were invited to talk to this American people. A lot of people were in the room, and we talked, and they told us what we do. They do this kind of negotiation, which is normal. And after an hour or so, I asked, do you also talk about the feelings of the people who are in this conflict? Do you think about the identities? Do you think about the questions of the mind, of the feelings, of what connects people to? And so they looked at me as if I'm coming from the Mars. And many years ago, Vamik Volkan started, maybe he was not the first, but he's the most known person who brought perspective of psychoanalysis and psychology in general into politics. He's certainly the best known, and mainly he started by Egyptians and Israeli when Sadat was coming. And the main issue is that he tries to look at conflicts between nations and communities from the point of view of maybe identities. The large group identity is maybe the main issue. Under a big tent, millions of people can unify in a, they are all together in a fight or in a flight. Surely now Ukrainians who were divided and had many other things, they come into the war, they are under this tent. They think about the large group identity. And then this is the main story. How do we define large group identities? What are the processes? What are the dynamics we go through? For example, if we are threatened, if the large group has a promise of glory, if you choose an event which was 2,000 years ago, and you say, this is what defined the nation now, and then you believe in it, and you go after a leader, and there can be a very narcissistic leader. All these things is the issues we deal with, and Vamik has written a lot of it. I can add that for me, the question of being in a soldier's matrix, which means a whole nation suddenly is enrolled in a war and has feelings that they to stop trauma or seek glory, and have also different dynamics. It can be added to all this thinking, which Bijan and me do and others do in the IDI. Is it okay, Bijan? You agree to this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I thought it was important to mention where we come from and why this dialogue will have a lot of reference to psychological and cultural and identity issues. And if I can come in right now, I mean, since we are now gradually going into the Iran-Israel dialogue, I want to say Iran is a large and relatively complex country, and it has a lot of different, if you want to call it that, identities. And I, as one person, can definitely not represent all of these identities. What I will try to do is try to explain some of the perceptions and some of the attitudes that exist, which have an influence on how we think about Israel. And if I may, Robi, if I may start here, just explaining some of the, because this is one of the key questions that many people in the world, including Israelis and Europeans and Americans, ask me is, why do Iranians antagonize Israel? And I think it's important to understand the different dimensions of this animosity, if you want to call it, because there are different layers, and some layers are losing significance and other layers are gaining significance. And it's important to understand. For me, there are at least 4 different dimensions. The one, historical, pre-revolutionary one you can call, is the fact that many, as you know, Iran had a so-called Islamic revolution in 1979. And some of you know that before the revolution, there was actually a relatively good relationship between Iran and Israel. We can always go into the reasons why that relationship was good. But many of the leaders of the Islamic revolution, actually, before the revolution, they lived in Lebanon with the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. For them, who then came and became the political leaders of Iran, political elite of Iran, they had experienced Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian relationship very differently. At the time when there were no social media and no daily reporting, they had actually their own experience with this confrontation, with this conflict. And they brought that back with a clear anti-Israeli sentiment back to the Iranian revolution, and obviously influenced the perceptions in Iran. The second layer is ideological revolutionary. This is how the Iranian revolution itself actually influenced the thinking. And that is what you all know. I'm talking about the tent that Robi was talking about. The tent of the Iranian revolution to unify everyone was on domestically, it was getting rid of the last ruler, the so-called Shah, the king of Iran. But externally, it was anti-Americanism. The Iranian revolution's tent was anti-Americanism. It united a lot of forces. And unfortunately, you can say, unfortunately for Iran-Israel relations, in that context, Israel is seen as an extension of the United States in the region. So anti-Israeli sentiment came as a clear consequence of anti-Americanism and the Iranian revolution. Robi, I'll just continue. There are 2 more dimensions, and then you can tell me how you feel, or as an Israeli, from an Israeli perspective, how you feel about these factors. The third one for me is very cultural. You may know that within Islam, there are Shiites and Sunnis. The majority are Sunnis, and the minority, mainly living in Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, are Shiites. And the Shiites have a cultural element of what they call siding with the victim. There is a clear sentiment towards supporting the victim. And it's not just about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There are lots of other scenarios, situations, conflicts where the Iranians developed the tendency, the sentiment of siding with the victim. Now, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, from an Iranian perspective, the Palestinians are the victim. And that generates a lot of sentiments among many Iranians. And this is when I was saying some layers are losing significance. The first 2 layers are losing significance, but this cultural layer is gaining significance. And it's important to understand, because through social media and international communications and so on, it's much more visible what is happening, and it gets reported, and that is important. And the fourth element, which is also important, and we need to understand it, is what I call a security military dimension of the relationship. Both Iran and Israel, they actually have one thing in common. Their security agenda is based on becoming the most powerful state of the region. They feel strategically lonely. We know that Israel has a lot of obvious international allies, but in the region, they feel strategically lonely, and to safeguard their security, they attempt to become the #1 power of the region. Obviously, you can't have two #1s in the region. So both of them try to undermine the other, and that confrontation also drives a number of activities and a number of agendas coming from Iran and also coming from Israel. And this is something we need to understand. So as you can see, it's a very diverse set of perceptions, views, agendas. And later in the discussion, we need to separate what is the agenda of the government of Iran and what's the agenda, or what are the perceptions, attitudes in the Iranian society, because these two are not always the same. I'll stop here. Robi, look forward to your reflections.
In 2 minutes, we can go and enter into a conflict, which I call the conflict between the victims. Who is the bigger victim, or who is attacked, and who has to defend himself? First of all, I want to say that in the years where the Shah was, I remember that there was a feeling that the Iranians were really quite an ally. And one of the issues in Israel, I think, for many, many people, is the disappointment of the change, because it was a complete change. And it was a complete change from people who I heard many times explaining to us that they were not Arabs, they were actually anti-Arabs, they have also common things with us. And of course, I mean, it was not a democracy, and there were many other issues, but I want to give one example which shows me how close people were to the Iranian side, and how many hopes Israeli had. And I told you this once, Bijan, in '84, it was in the middle of the war between Iraq and Iran. I was in the military, and some people came to us and told us to go down and give some jeeps with a gun on it, and a cannon on it. And we were sitting there and waiting until all this procedure goes. And I asked them, where do you take this? And they said, we are selling it to Iran. And the only thing I can say is that I saw around me that everyone was agreeing to it. All the officers sitting there, all the people who heard. I mean, it was very interesting. They took it from us, and so I think there is something very strongly. It was probably an effort to get closer again to Iran. I believe that Iran was in big trouble in these years, let's say in the year 80 or 84, or I don't know, I don't remember what year it was. But this is the first issue, that you have an ally, and this ally, because of inner changes completely the relation. I think we as a nation took it very different. I think it as a large group, as in our large group identity, this was an ally, and now we were alone. And the other thing is that this rhetoric of the Iranians, who are actually almost 2,000 kilometers from us, I don't know, almost, became stronger and stronger with the years. And there are moments when there is also a denying of the Holocaust. A denying of the Holocaust in Israel is felt as a denial of our existence almost. And then there is something which in Israel puts you into a big existential conflict. And it is the two principles I think the state of Israel has since its existence and since the Holocaust. One is never again. And this never again, you can translate it not only to Israel, you can translate this never again now to Ukraine. You know, they are under invasion, and they will, I believe that if they, the part which will survive, they will fight, and they will, this never again will happen to them too, and probably it happened to Iran too at one time, never again. And the other thing is, there is a proverb for in the army and others who says, if somebody wants to kill you, get up earlier in the morning and kill him. And this is a very important issue in Israel. Everything is preventive. It's a big problem because not everything can be prevented, but it is a bigger problem because actually if it works, you always are I mean, probably you have to have in 200 years or 300 years, maybe we are in the situation of Denmark between I don't know, Norway and Holland, but still you can have probably someone who threatens you.
If I may come in, Robi.
Yes, sure.
Thank you. I personally, as someone who has lived in Europe and obviously interacted with both Europeans and also Israelis and Jews, I fully appreciate the sentiments you just described. But for many Iranians, the whole Jewish experience is not vivid. It's something you read in history books. And if you have politicians who want to manipulate your sentiments and sell their own narrative, then it's easy to come up with for example, what the former president Ahmadinejad did with this Holocaust denial, which, to be fair to the Iranian political elite, none of the other key players ever picked up. This is important to understand. When Ahmadinejad denied the Holocaust, the former president, the reformist president Mohammad Khatami, who was president before Ahmadinejad, he came out and said, even if only one Jew had been killed, it would have been too bad. So there were other or none of the other important players in Iran ever picked this up. And it's important to understand that it was just in my view, stupid sort of initiative by Ahmadinejad, who thought that one can hurt Israel by denying the Holocaust. And in my view, it was a strategic mistake and had nothing to do with, let's say, the Iranian attitude or the Iranian perceptions. I have to underline here, some of you may not know, but Iran is still the host or the sort of country for the largest Jewish community outside Israel in the region. We have a Jewish community, we have a Jewish member of parliament, there are synagogues, and the fact that we have a Jewish community compels the Iranian political elite to always distinguish between Judaism and Zionism. So they keep saying our problem is with Zionism, our problem is not with Judaism. But there are not enough nuanced knowledge and thinking about the future, about what can be done, is also to try to present basically the Jewish history, especially what led to the creation of Israel, and as the sentiments that you just mentioned, to sort of maybe make a few even Persian documentaries and put it on YouTube so that Iranians can actually follow this and have a better understanding of the situation. I want to touch on two things you said. One, the sort of alliance that you felt before the Iranian Revolution. In sort of today's language, I would say that was an alliance based on geopolitical realities of the time. And in my view, these types of alliances or relationships don't last because geopolitical realities change, as we can see today with what's happening in Europe between Russia and Ukraine and other European members. Geopolitical realities of that time were that both Iran and Israel were allies of the United States. And as you mentioned, both of them were antagonized by the Arabs. Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, came up with this term of peripheral minorities. He referred to Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey, because they were the three Muslim countries that were non-Arabs, as the peripheral minorities. And you tell a civilization like Iran with millennia of history, you are a peripheral minority, obviously you upset them. And that's why it was clear that Israel and Iran were the sort of national allies before the revolution. But that geopolitical reality changed with the Iranian Revolution. The second fact I wanted to say, and this hopefully will give some comfort to some Israelis, because the same way you say the Israeli would prevent and get up in the morning and go and kill the person who might kill him, in the case of Iran, I can tell you, and this has been tested in many situations, the Iranians react. If someone comes to them and says, this person is going to kill you, they will say, well, let's wait and see what he does. And if he tries to do anything, then I'm going to respond. And that's the fact of reaction, as opposed to prevention, should give Israel some degree of comfort, especially that also the supreme leader of the country, the highest authority of the country, has also confirmed that Iran will never engage in a first strike. This is a military doctrine. The doctrine says you only strike if you have been hit. And it's important to understand that the psychology is very different.
Bijan, now the problem is if there is a possibility to believe, to take in what you say and to accept. And I tell you, the psychological side of living in Israel and looking at what Iran does, and even if you are a person like me who is quite positive and liberal, and I have a friend called Bijan and other friends also who which I can talk to, but still I can tell you a couple of things. First of all, Ahmadinejad was not a small event. It was many years an event who brought many times a lot of anti-Semitic feelings, a lot of not only anti-Zionist. And it is an event where if somebody says something and nobody really reacts, but lets him do, then it's actually the government is accepting. I don't want to go too far because I am trying to think, when can I believe that I'm secure enough? And this is actually the main issue. The second thing is, you are forgetting that you have a government, not only a people, which I know that many of these people would immediately try to have some kind of relation with Israel. and some not, of course, a lot of not. But there are two armies. There is one voice, and then there is the other voice of the people who not only help Assad to win his civil war, which is quite difficult issue. You know, Assad is not the greatest Democrat, and not only Democrat or liberal, but they are here in there. You say they only react, but actually they are sitting at our frontiers, and they are the second voice of Iran. Iran is talking with two voices. One voice says, we don't want an atomic bomb. The other voice says, in 2 weeks, we will have an atomic bomb. You know, this double thing in matters of psychology, in the identity, in the national identity or the large group identity of Israel, it makes people paranoid.
I fully understand that. I mean, it's difficult, and that's why I started by saying Iran is a very complex phenomenon, both the society, but also the government, or what you can call the state. Obviously, we can sit and discuss who acted first and who is reacting. One of the reasons why Iran was so insistent that Bashar Assad has to survive and the Syrian structure has to survive was because, see, in the security equation between Iran and Israel, Israel has nuclear weapons, Israel has the US protection, Israel has definitely the more advanced army. What does Iran have? The only thing they have managed to carve out as a sort of security deterrent. As you know, in the military terms, they talk about deterrent. Israel has its own deterrence. Iran's deterrent is to be present on Israeli borders through the Lebanese Hezbollah and through a partnership you can call alliance with the Syrians. And now, you know that if Syrian if Bashar Assad would have fallen and some anti-Iranian regime would have come to power in Syria, Iran would have lost its deterrent because it would have also lost access to Lebanon. So what I'm saying is you have to understand this in the eyes of the Iranians or Iranian strategists as a way of maintaining what they would call a deterrent, which every military will try to do. But it's important to underline that they have not used any of these capacities, and also from what we hear, they have also not reacted harshly to some of the Israeli attacks on Iranian positions in Syria. So it's like there is, in my view, despite all the things you hear, the Iranians are not there to escalate with Israel because they would have enough reasons. Israelis have assassinated Iranian nuclear scientists. They have attacked Iranian infrastructure with cyber attacks and so on. So it's a different, but I want to just say a couple of sentences about Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad, yes, he was elected president. Unfortunately, I can say I was not in favor of that. As president, he made statements, but he did not really represent Iran, not even the Iranian political elite. It's the same thing that we could see very visibly with Donald Trump and the US. Today, you would not say, there may be people who say that, but you would not say that Trump actually represented the entirety of the US. And Ahmadinejad was that, and the fact is that he has been marginalized since he left office. He was not allowed to run for president again. And that gives me a bit of comfort that he did not represent the political elite or the society of Iran.
I would like us to not go further than another 2, 3, 4 minutes. I have a question for you, because first of all, the alliances in the Middle East are different now, and there are some Arabs who are with us, and actually, since Egypt, our relation with the Arabs is changing. I mean, we have the Palestinian problems, which we didn't solve, but two things I want to ask you. It would, I tell you from the point of what would, I think, help Israelis to calm down. Do you think there is any chance that this two-state army, two armies in one state, and this extreme strategy actually, is there a possibility that your country says, like many countries did after a revolt or revolution, okay, we have the revolution army, but now we have only one army, and this army is doing this and this, what the government wants, and not. And the other is the question of, do you think there is a possibility that there will be a change in the government, and they will, for example, ally to this new force in order to make a real power, you know? So the Shiite and the Sunni would get a little closer, because I have the feeling that we are not only the West, but also in a way, a kind of a victim of this conflict between Sunnis and Shiites.
First of all, I don't think there is a conflict between Shiites and Sunnis. There are people, political forces who would like to use that sort of duality to create more confrontations within the Islamic world or within our region. But let me come to the more important element. See, partly, I believe, partly because of the preventive nature that you just described, Israeli governments, especially the more hardline governments over the past 2 decades, have used their influence with the US government and different US stakeholders to put more pressure on Iran, thinking that by sanctioning Iran and by putting pressure on Iran and by insisting that the nuclear deal, which was an important instrument of gradually bringing Iran back into the international community, that it was actually, you know, in a way violated by Donald Trump. And look at what the result has been. By putting pressure on Iran, by sanctioning Iran, and by exiting the nuclear deal, which was a very important deal, the external forces have created a lot more space for the hardliners in Iran. So the two armies you're talking about, it's more accurate to say that there are different competing attitudes to international relations in Iran. And obviously the competing attitudes, if I can very briefly describe them, one is more the conciliatory one, which is driven more by the reformists and moderates in Iran, and one is confrontational. And that confrontational, unfortunately, is dominating right now, because the conciliatory agenda of negotiating with the Americans and the Europeans and the world powers and signing a nuclear deal proved a mistake, because Trump exited it with the support of Israel. So what I'm saying is, if you want to see the conciliatory voice of Iran and the conciliatory political forces of Iran, which is more reflective of the majority of the society, to breathe and to influence political decisions, then one has to stop antagonizing Iran. It's very difficult, I understand, but your preventive approach has given more space to those elements who are there to confront you. So it's actually self-defeating, in my view. And a lot of people who were in favor of Trump policies, the so-called maximum pressure, when it emerged 4 or 5 years ago, they see that today. They see that actually, if you want to de-escalate with Iran, you have to extend your hand, you have to show respect. And the same way, by the way, I was it was interesting. The same way you showed respect to me, you said you are the larger country, you start. That's a very simple respect, but it goes a very long way because it de-escalates. It creates comfort and it creates some degree of trust. The Iranians, in my view, the more moderate forces were ready to trust the world, especially the Americans. Don't forget, Israel is seen as an extension of the US, but they were slapped in their face by Trump. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of marginalized the reformists. I can tell you when Mohammad Khatami was president, the reformist president, in his government, there was a debate inside the strategy committees. And I remember very well, they would call it, they were saying, let's choose the Malaysian model for Israel. And I used to ask them, what is the Malaysian model? They said Malaysia, as an Islamic country, doesn't recognize Israel, but doesn't antagonize Israel. So they had already started thinking about it. But then events, internal and external, including 9/11, US attack on Iraq, US attack on Afghanistan, US policies of the past 20 years, unfortunately also Israeli policies of the past 20 years, they have marginalized the reformists. Yeah. And now the hardliners are unfortunately the loudest voice, as the Americans say.
Yeah. Okay, Bijan, let's give the stage to the others, and maybe we will answer some questions or whatever.
Thank you very much. And I think this discussion could go on for quite a while. Richard, can you take over and moderate a bit?
I would be happy to.
Is there any possibility that we can make the audience become panelists?
If anyone in our audience would like to speak and respond and have questions and comments, I would be happy to allow everyone to be able to ask questions, whether as panelists or however. I'll do my best with the technology.
Excuse me, also, Richard, I'm directing to you now. We discussed not to record the questions. What is your idea? What is your idea, Robi? And
I don't mind. I personally, I don't mind if we continue. If it's okay for?
We're talking about that perhaps people in the audience would hesitate.
Well, Eva, I think if Robbie's okay and John is okay, we're fine with that. Anyone would like to begin with any reactions or questions or comments?
Thank you for the sharing. I get a sentence from Bijan when Robi emphasized that there is a conflict of Shias and Sunnis in the region. You transform this sentence. There is no conflict, but there is duality. I'm living in Turkey, and I'm a part of this structure also, in a way. And philosophically, it is a duality, but in the reality, it is very sharp conflict nowadays on the field and in the real life. I experience this as a very sharp conflict in this country, in the region. I would like to ask how it happens to transform it as a duality in the region, as a philosophic manner. It's okay, but life is changing, and then nowadays and for a long time, when I experienced the Arab Spring and the effect of the Arab Spring in the region, and then Abraham Accords in the region, I experienced not duality, very sharp reality. Thank you.
Janer, I didn't say there are no conflicts in our region. There are many conflicts. There are also many tensions within different societies, whether it's Turkey or Iran, and also between different countries. But in my view, trying to explain these conflicts because of the duality between Shias and Sunnis is a mistake. The real conflict is somewhere else. The real conflict could be because of political structures. The real conflict could be because certain elements within the different societies are not fully represented. I can tell you, for example, about 10% of the Iranian society are Sunnis, and they are not well represented, and they are definitely discriminated against. But it's not because their conflict, their problem with the overall political system is not because of the divide between Sunnis and Shias, it's because they are not represented politically. The difference within Iraq, you know better than I do, is also a question of dividing political power between the different groups. It's not, then if it's about Sunnis and Shias, how do you explain the fact that the Kurds also have a problem with the structure? Kurds are both Shiites and Sunnis. So it's, in my view, bringing the sectarian divide as an explanation is a simplified explanation. I think we need to go a bit deeper, understand what the issues are, what the concerns are, and try to tackle those political, sometimes ethnic issues, sometimes economic issues that just simply are brushed away by saying, oh, this is all about sectarian divide. In my view, that's a simplification of the realities.
And I remember the book of dear Vamik Volkan, Religious Knives, which is very important topic contributing to this issue. And I'm happy that dear Vamik Volkan is with us here. Richard.
Yes.
Can I say something? Is that possible?
Of course.
Okay. I like to say that this dialogue between my friends Bijan and Robi illustrates the importance of unofficial dialogues to understand each other's thoughts and make corrections or find new ways of thinking about each other and so on. And before Oslo Accords, we brought together Arabs and Israelis for 6 years. And again, I'm suggesting that hearing both of you and hearing the importance of this kind of dialogue, is there a possibility to suggest starting a continuing unofficial dialogue between influential Iranians and influential Israelis, maybe to last even some years, maybe every 4 months, every 3 months, and then whatever comes from there to influence the leaders, because whatever we do, whatever we understand, and reality is that leaders make decisions and so on, how to influence them. So I listened to you with great interest and with fascination, once more giving me the, almost a proof that this kind of dialogue is so important when there's chronic problems. And is there any way that both of you and the leaders starting a dialogue between the two countries?
If I may respond, Vamik, it's good to have you here. Thank you for the comment. There are some so-called track 1.5 and track 2 diplomatic meetings that bring together sort of stakeholders, university professors, business people, journalists, and so on from both countries. Usually not just the two countries together. It's usually a larger group, including Europeans, Americans, sometimes other nations, also Arabs. So it's not necessarily focused on Iran and Israel, but there are meetings where representatives from both sides come together. And in fact, I have been to a number of these meetings. I can tell you, when you sit and talk about contentious issues, like, for example, I mentioned security or different policies or nuclear programs and so on, it's difficult to find common ground. But the moment you start talking about what I call soft security issues, you start talking about water and climate change and health issues, and then you suddenly have a completely different dynamics. And my suggestion to whoever is listening and whoever has the opportunity to do that is to create more space for this type of dialogue. Because the biggest challenge for all of us in the next 2 decades will not be military security. The biggest challenge will be the soft security issues. We are all going to face climate change issues and food issues and pandemics and so on. And there, obviously, there is a lot the two countries can offer each other. So yes, there are some meetings, and I'm very happy to be involved in future meetings, but there is also, the selection of topics will also be important so that they become more constructive.
I know that you have been so busy, Bijan, with this kind of things. And before I say what I want to say, I like to say that we cannot get rid of the reality world. So I respect realities, economic issues, legal issues, and so on. But again, what is needed, what I'm saying, is a psychologically informed dialogue, like you had here in front of us. It's a special kind of meeting run by a neutral party, so to speak, to bring these issues, because whatever we do at the end, large group identity issues, psychological issues, they become the obstacles. And in order to remove them, a specific kind of dialogue, not business people and so on. You have to have business people in it, but running it differently so that certain suggestions, important suggestions come up how to enrich the relationship in a positive way. Thank you.
Yeah, what I can say is that I think one has to start where we can, because the mere existence of such a dialogue has an influence.
Yes.
But it's really difficult to understand, or maybe not, that that, for example, if the thing of the extremist becoming more extremist because of the threats of the other side is in both sides. Yes. It's a vicious circle.
Yes.
You know, and it's very difficult to stop it. So, for example, my example is when the government, very extreme government, wanted to bomb now Iran, the generals said, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. This is preemptive, but it's too preemptive. I mean, you cannot attack everyone. You cannot. And actually they won this. So what kind of security measures would be enough in order to enable a dialogue? And this is a question which right now is on the worst place it has ever been.
Robi, there is actually an interesting forum where obviously it would take a clear decision in the Israeli government. But as you know, there is a UN initiative called the Middle East Free of Weapons of Mass Destruction. And the only Middle Eastern country that is not represented there is Israel. Mm-hmm. That could be a forum to start talking, even talk about peace and talk about, you know, some sort of you can call it military or security arrangements that would reduce the tensions. I think the opportunity is there, but I can also tell you from what I've heard and experienced is that sort of Israel considers itself an exception to all the rules in this region, and that is not helping right now.
Yeah, I think it's very complicated, but please, maybe other people have some questions.
And there is a question of Maria Silveira
Yes.
on the chat, and she asks, what about trust? How to see the other in a different way if there is no trust? Yes, to the panelists, Robi and Bijan.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a big question because the situation, I think the situation has changed, and the revolutionary army, this part of which is extreme in Iran, is not only reacting, it is actually proacting. And it has been maybe influenced by Israel, I don't, or just by military, but it is now not 2,000 kilometers away. I think it would be easier to have, even if in this time of rockets, to have a distance, a gap of 2,000 kilometers between us instead of being on the frontier. You know, it's you have the same thing in this discussion now with Russia. Please, maybe somebody. I just say that I'll be happy to participate in some place where important Israelis can say, try to bring trust to this dialogue, yeah, to this relation. We have a relation, but it is a paranoid relation.
I want to just say a couple of sentences about the issue of trust. Unfortunately, the world missed a big opportunity with this nuclear deal with Iran. This was really, you can say, the Iranian attempt to reestablish trust. And in fact, just before the nuclear deal was signed in 2015, the highest Iranian authority, the supreme leader, said very clearly, he said, if this deal works out and we see the benefits that we think we will have, then we can start talking about other deals. Because back then there was talking about limitations on Iranian regional activity and missiles and so on. Unfortunately, maybe because of the desire in Israel to be preemptive, but also unfortunately because Trump got into the White House after Obama signed the deal, it all collapsed. And it will take probably another decade of diplomacy to come up with something similar, a framework that can help, because trust will need confidence building, and confidence building needs a mechanism. And this deal was a mechanism. Whether we will get another one, I don't know, but if another one comes along, we all have to make sure that it stays and it sort of is used to build confidence and to build trust. Unfortunately, we have had a missed opportunity. Now, hopefully the next time our politicians won't miss the opportunity.
If anyone has any comments, reactions, feel free.
Yeah,
Everyone is able to speak now.
I'd like to say something.
Of course.
My name is Ruben. I'm a colleague of Robi in the IDI. I've known him for a while, and of course know Bijan and some of the other participants. Let's get back to history. There was a great emperor by the name of Cyrus. In the 6th century BC, he signed or promulgated the first Zionist declaration. urging all the Jews to come back to the country. And in that, he started actually the rebuilding of the Second Temple, which goes to show that the historic relations between Jews or Israelis and Iranians or Persians or whatever you call it are there. They are deeply imbued in our culture, deeply imbued in our joint history, and they are a good starting point for a continuation. Now, if you collect or if you gather 30 people from the UN and one Israeli to start discuss the Middle East, this is useless, this is futile. But if you put 10 intelligent Iranians, and there are lots of them, and if you put 10 intelligent Israelis in one room for an open discussion, and you invite all of them to go to Persepolis, and you invite all of them to come to the places which are so much connected with the joint Persian Jewish history, you have a good starting point combining respect, recognition, and knowledge. And by creating the first basis for human contact between human beings, rather than starting at level 11 in diplomatic relations, just have a group of human beings discussing. And the best would be for the Iranians to invite Israelis to come to Tehran or to Persepolis, and for Israelis then to invite a group of Iranians to come to Israel and to discuss quietly the things which are on the agenda. And then they will all see that we have the mentality. The Israelis have the mentality of a small nation surrounded by enemies, and the Iranians have the mentality of a large nation surrounded by enemies. And if we remove these obstacles and create a basis of human respect and recognition, I think we can go ahead. And I think what we are doing today is perhaps a small step forward. And I would say it should be held or should be promulgated and promoted in a very small circle. And the first thing, if the Iranians really want to show that they are interested in something, they should invite a group of Israelis. I can vouch together with Robi that if there is any question, we can arrange within 2 weeks invitation for 10 Iranians to come to Israel for fertile exchange. Thank you very much.
May I quickly react to this? Thank you, Reuven. Great idea. In fact, Robi had asked me to come up with some suggestions how we can change the relationship in the future. And I had written down diplomacy surrounding cultural heritage. And this is exactly what you're saying. We do have common cultural heritage. And apart from Cyrus the Great being mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, there are also, as I said, the Jewish communities in Iran, Jewish heritage in Iran. And it would be important. I like the idea. We just have to start thinking how we can make it happen. But the cultural heritage, completely detached from political and security aspects, could be a good way of trying to improve the understanding on both sides.
May I make a comment?
Of course.
My name is Jerry Frum. I'm the current president of the International Dialogue Initiative. And I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you to my friends and colleagues, Bijan and Robi, for doing this. I find myself thinking about a psychological aspect of the trouble. Wilfred Bijan, in his theory about basic assumptions in group life, talks about the military as essentially the reification of the fight-flight dynamic in threatened groups. From that angle, the military contains the society's fear and their hatred of the people who made them afraid. And in a way, they exist on the boundary, the projective boundary between that society and the other whom they're afraid of and therefore hate. And I'm very interested in whether the society finds ways of owning its fear and its hatred. I think back to Robi's initial comment, we don't speak about fear in these negotiations. And if that owning of the fear and hatred of the other also has an element to it, which is what we fear and hate within our own societies. Because it seems to me that so much, Vamek wrote about this a long, long time ago, the need for the other as the enemy in order to take care of the tensions within one's own society. So I wonder if either of you might want to talk about the within society anxieties and fears and hatreds that then get projected onto the other, and that other then plays a role in confirming that.
Yeah.
Robi, will you respond first?
Yeah, well, I have one response, you know. There are in Israel about, I think it was about 80,000 Iranian Jews who fled Iran. And many of them, and a very prominent people. Between them, there is a singer who is maybe the most prominent singer in Israel. And there are many other people who are very, very prominent in Israel. And they actually have a lot of longing for Iran. They could be a great, I think they could be a great bridge like the Moroccan Jews were, if they let them. The Moroccan Jews, they really bridge between the Moroccan state and Israel. But you have to let them be. I think one of the problems is that the Revolutionary Army, I think it started, this rift really started when the embassy in Buenos Aires was bombed, and probably Iranian people were involved, or this is what we believe. And you know about these things, if it's true or not, it's much less important than what you believe. So in order to organize this process, which started then, and it went down until now, that there are almost every night there are bombings in the Golan Heights. Yesterday there was one 10 kilometers from our, I mean, the deterioration of trust and belief has to be countered, and it can be only countered in this stage by leaders. And I don't see neither in Israel nor in this religious constellation, but I don't know enough. I don't see a leader who is able to say, let's stop it. Let's stop it. Like Sadat said, let's stop it. Let's try to, I don't know, change the approach. Let's change in the educational system. Let's do some congresses. Let's actually small groups. This is a response to Ruven. Small groups are very good in thinking together, but they are very bad in really influencing. I mean, you need larger groups, and you need small groups or medium groups of politicians like Jerry and me, conducted in Northern Ireland, and I think Vamik was also part, but it was bigger than small groups. And yes, it's a big question for me. How can we right now establish a place where we can increase trust?
Jerry, thank you for the question. I think in Iran, we have to distinguish between what we may call the state, that, as I explained, sees anti-Americanism and by extension, sort of confrontation with Israel as a unifying theme of the revolution and of what came after the revolution. But then the society is very different. The Iranian society is not necessarily afraid of Israel. I can tell you that. But they do register, and this is important, especially for my Israeli friends, they do register Israeli acts that sort of undermine the development in Iran. Most importantly, as I said, this whole concept of not allowing the nuclear deal to survive. And they watch it right now. There's a lot of political awareness. They're also watching right now, I mean, the so-called Vienna talks. Actually, apparently the only remaining issue between the two sides, between the Iranians and the Americans, to re-establish some sort of an understanding is the so-called foreign terrorist organization designation of the Revolutionary Guards. And the main opponent to that, to lifting that designation, is Israel. So the Iranians register that. They are not afraid of Israel, but they do see Israel as a problem for Iran to sort of re-engage the West, if we can call it that way. And that is definitely, that leads to sentiments. Having said that, in 2012, there was a very interesting social media campaign, actually started with an Israeli putting a poster on Facebook saying, we love Iranians and we are not going to attack you. And that sort of created a chain of events where then thousands of Iranians and Israelis sent each other or posted posters expressing respect and love for the other side. And I think these are very small movements, but they also reflect some of the sentiments. So the people, I think, have no issue with each other. And that is where we have to start. People to people, initiatives, contacts, maybe initially meeting in a third place, whether it's Dubai or Turkey or another country where both actually have a good relationship and there are no visa restrictions. So people to people relations could actually help and gradually build the trust or correct the misperceptions. I think that's important to underline at this stage as well.
I want to ask do we have now another 5 minutes or 10 minutes or yes?
I think you're about 7.
I wanted to say to the audience some words about you, Bijan, because I have the feeling that you are, okay, you don't have the political power to suggest, and what you are suggesting is suggesting us things, and I have the feeling we should continue this dialogue until both sides suggest some space. But I want to praise you a bit, Bijan, because I know people don't know that you actually were in prison in Iran, just came back from Europe. I think, I'm not sure until this day that you know exactly why. Maybe you know, but you didn't tell me. But I suspect that it's not clear. And you have a lot of courage to speak with us. And I have the feeling this courage is also one of the ingredients of trust. When I meet someone with courage, I start to trust. I personally also trust you, really, but I think this is part of the, I don't know if I explain myself, but I really admire this position of you, and I think you are the kind of person who is really can make a change, or at least a change in those people who listen.
Thank you, Robi. It's very kind. I think we all have a responsibility to try to work towards peace. And I think the word peace, in fact, this social media campaign that I mentioned in 2012 crystallized very clearly that peace is very important to both nations, Israelis and Iranians. And this is maybe something we can build upon, that, you know, we need peace. And we need peace so that we can actually develop as a society. We can achieve our own goals, whether they are cultural or economic or political. Without peace, we can't. This is, I think, that's an important fact that's sinking in gradually. That's why I mentioned this whole notion of soft security issues, soft national security issues that are much more important than the hard ones. The hard ones, yes, we can be afraid of you know, conventional and non-conventional armies, but in the words of one Iranian politician whom I respected, at one point he said, when there is a flood, all of us will be taken by that flood. You know, we have to focus on these things, and for that we need peace and better understanding. I'm really happy that this opportunity emerged, and I'm very happy to continue the dialogue, definitely.
I believe Oleg in our audience wished to say something or be noticed. If you like.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The talk is trying to humanly find solutions other than war to the problems which are in between us. I have no, my voice is very, I have no the loud voice, but you know, I have taken it upon myself before I die to raise it and to hope that it would find some place in the hearts and minds of other people, and it would be raised and finally reach the political decision makers, because I cannot see a rational objection to that, which is heard all around by politicians. You know, just yesterday I heard that somebody says, well, if Putin does that, violates the United Nations Charter and commits crime, we cannot talk with him. You can tell him what you tell to other people. Everyone is human. Okay, no, that is what I wanted to tell you. I see, Bijan, that you are nodding with your head, so.
I agree. I think, first of all, both countries, the Israelis and also the Iranians, have shown that they can talk to their enemies and find some sort of a solution. Iran negotiated with Saddam Hussein after the Iran-Iraq war and achieved a ceasefire. Iran negotiated with the Americans, and each time there was a common interest. Whether it was in the case of Iran and the US, the first time they had serious discussions was the post-Taliban developments in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. So yes, the common ground has to be there. But as we discussed earlier, the first step is building trust. And we need to find those areas where we can build confidence and build trust between the two sides. I think when the moment comes, then there could be opportunities for dialogue and for negotiations. Trust building is, I think, something we have to all contribute to.
Bijan and Robi, would you like to conclude with a sentence or so before it's time for us to break?
Well, for me, it was, I think when you are in the middle of a crisis, you sometimes forget that there are possibilities to engage in a different than violent solution. And this is what I always, this is what I learned actually in many conflicts, not only in this conflict. And that's why it was important for me in the midst of this Ukrainian-Russian and in the midst of really an escalation which we have with Iran, I know that there are people I can talk to in the Iranian, and we represent, both Bijan and me, I think I'm sure we represent a large part of the people who would make it possible. So I thank you I thank you, Bijan, for being my partner, and I thank the IAGP for giving this space. It's a very important space.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank everyone as well, Robi and the organizers. I would just close with highlighting something I said earlier. We need more and more people-to-people dialogue. We need to show respect and compassion. And as I said, peace is one common value that we can build on. Let us work on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Bijan and dear Robi, having a part of this very important issue, which is dialogue. And nowadays it is not easy. We are experiencing the war in the east part of the Europe nowadays. And you are talking from the Middle East, which is very full of pain and full of history, and sharing your experiences, how to create the dialogue. And it is not easy, but we need to stop this brutality everywhere in the world to build peace, dialogue, and hope for the better times. And as an IGP, we will create and we will try to create this structure as a container for all colleagues who are experiencing difficult times in the region of war, especially nowadays in Ukraine. It's full of pain and people are suffering, and we want to hear and learn from them also. And you open this door for our colleagues. I hope there will be a continuation to connect with you all. And thank you again for all participants and for Alona having a very good work every time. Yes, there will be a continuation. Thank you, Robi and Bijan. And thank you to dear
Kaner and Richard and Eva. Bye. Bye-bye.
I want to thank you all, and I want to give the last word to our president, Richard Beck, to close our meeting.
I wish we were all having a meal together and we could just continue to talk and have good food together, because this conversation has been quite a meal for all of us to take in, a very important meal for our hearts and our souls. So thank you, everybody. And on behalf of IAGP, Robi and Bjorn, what a wonderful job you've both done. Thank you.